The table is set. Brooklyn travels to Boston to kick off the first round of the NBA playoffs on Sunday. You know what we're here to do. Break down some of the key stats from the season series and whether or not they should carry over to this playoff matchup, how important Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant will be to overcoming Boston's elite defense, and why stats can be fickle sometimes when you break down clutch gene versus defense. All coming up, my friends, right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo.
That's right. It is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there is Doug Norrie, owner-operator, DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings, FanDuel, DraftKings. He's got you covered. I am Adam Arbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants over on the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And my friends, and by friends, I mean Doug, this is what we've been waiting for. We're going to talk about the matchup with Boston. We're going to look back at the season series, one game in particular that really is where we can sink our teeth into key takeaways, and then look at some stats that favor both sides of this matchup. As I think, Doug, just at the onset, this feels like it's going to be a electric series and also one that will drastically contrast what we look back on from last year's playoffs.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like last year, the Nets completely rolled over the Celtics. It wasn't close. I know the Celtics took a game. That was more just because it's harder to sweep a series than it was about like the Celtics actually getting back into the series. Tatum put them all on their back, and that was kind of a way it went. But I mean, the Nets completely crushed the Celtics. That's not going to be the case this time around.
Ooh.
We're going to end up talking to John Careless from Locked On Celtics tomorrow. So we'll go into even more detail on where the series is going to go. But I think we can already see by how this is shaping up by the seedings, which I think are obviously like a little wrong. When it comes to where the Nets are, it's not wrong that the Celtics are a 2 seed. I mean, they've played like a 2 seed, and we'll talk about some of the stats for them this season. So they are not in the wrong place. Maybe the Nets are sort of misseeded for their overall talent levels for the reasons that we're very clear on it up until this point. But the Celtics aren't. This is going to be a very tough series. You're going to hear it over the next couple of days, like as we prepare for what's going to go in here. This is going to be a formidable test for the Nets.
Yeah, you talk about, I think, 26-6 over the back half of the season for the Boston Celtics.
Awesome.
They have they've earned 100% that 2 seed, right? There's some weirdness sometimes depending on how teams start the regular season versus what happens in behind them, especially in this case, the Eastern Conference. But no, Boston is incredibly deserving of it, and maybe in that regard, it's one more thing in the ups and downs and ebbs and flows of Brooklyn's season. You also find yourself, because you're the 7th seed, having to take on a very confident team in Boston that's playing at a high level. When we look back then at the season series between these two teams, here's the problem. When we reflect on it, the first game of the season, which the Nets won, had James Harden on that roster. Didn't have Kyrie Irving, had Patty Mills shooting at a high level, and Kevin Durant. 2 games in between, none of the stars played. Brooklyn Nets got trounced. It's only when we get to that last game of the season series where I think we get a real sense and can have legitimate takeaways that we apply to this series going forward. It was a tight game. It was an intense game, and it required one heck of a performance from Jayson Tatum for Boston to pull it out.
Yeah, look, the Nets lost that one in Boston, 126-120. Tatum was absolutely amazing. So like sort of borderline transcendent in the scoring. Ended up scoring 54 points and a lot of that work was done in the fourth quarter for the Celtics to erase a 7-point deficit and end up winning. A 6-point deficit and end up winning. But you're right when we look at trying to find a proxy over the course of this regular season, this is really the only game that even comes close.
Yeah.
The other ones are not. I mean, don't even bother. Don't bother looking at the box scores of those games. The teams were completely different. Either the Nets were mostly the Nets were completely different. But in this game, at least, it was, after the trade deadline, the Nets starting lineup is the same starting lineup we're going to see in game 1. Kai, KD, Bruce Brown, Seth Curry, and Andre Drummond. And the Celtics was 4/5 of what they're going to be throwing out to start the season. They had Robert Williams in that game. They're not going to have him in this one, but Marcus Smart, Jaylen Brown, Jayson Tatum and Al Horford did play. So this is a really close look at how these two teams matched up, and we'll talk a little bit about it. But the Nets ended up losing by 6, but it was a close game. Like it took a really, really not historic, but I'm I said transcendent before. It took an amazing 50-point game by Jayson Tatum for them to kind of pull away in the end. Is that going to be, something they can recreate? No, but we also saw that the Nets sort of have trouble with some of the things that Boston was doing as well.
Yeah, the big jump out stat for me off of the big performance from Tatum in that game, 54 points, but 8 of 15 from beyond the arc. Like that's an impressive stat. It doesn't mean that he can't shoot that percentage from beyond the arc, but on that volume, that's a big ask. I think.
Can I say one thing about that with him too? Like
can.
He just absolutely could not miss in the fourth quarter either. Like he was 5 for 8 and 1 for 3 from beyond the arc, but 5 for 8. He got to line 8 times, went 7 for 8. Like he was unstoppable in that fourth quarter. He was the whole team basically in the fourth quarter.
And by the way, you mentioned getting to the line, 14 of 17 total trips in the game for Jayson Tatum as well. So a lot of and again, it's not to say that Jayson Tatum can't do those things, but I remember going back to when we came out of that game doing the post game, it took that level of performance from Jayson Tatum to overcome the Brooklyn Nets. It doesn't mean that every game would require that for the Celtics to win. But when I looked over inside of like the Nets stat lines, you see 12 of 21 for Kevin Durant, 8 of 18 for Kyrie Irving. I mean, listen, they combined for 50 plus points. You got a back half of the season performance from Bruce Brown, 6 of 10 from the field. Certainly, is there something inside of the starting line for the Brooklyn Nets that you look at and go, well, this is exactly what we anticipate? The wrinkle that I thought about was looking down and seeing Nicholas Claxton, 18 minutes, 1 of 4. Kind of a quiet line from him. Whereas now we're going to talk about the injuries for both sides here later on. I think that Claxton's impact maybe elevates here. It looks like there's more players that could do more for Brooklyn than in that final matchup.
The one change we're likely to see with Brooklyn, or I'm almost definitely going to see in this game as compared to the first game, and where this first game differed, is that like at this point in the season, LaMarcus Aldridge was still in the rotation, and he is no longer in the rotation. Like he's not coming. He's not coming back. Short of. Look, I've been these definitive. Every time I say something definitive, it's wrong. So I'm like really, really shook on some of these definitive.
Put your chips on the line, brother. Come on, lay them down one more.
Man,
come on, snake eyes.
I've had even people contact me. It's like unbelievable, like the run you're on. It's like I know. Okay, he's not coming back. But he played a lot of minutes in this game, 23 minutes. Those are going to be redispersed to almost 1-to-1 Claxton. I mean, Claxton's not gonna play 41 minutes, but like. Drummond only played 17. It is harder for Drummond to stay on the court in this matchup. I'm not sure we see so many more minutes out of him, but clearly Claxton is going to play more than the 18 he played, 24, 25. So those will go somewhere else. Frankly, someone will just go back to like Durant. Durant played 39 minutes, and we're going to see, 42, 43 out of him, basically from all the rest of the way. So that is probably the one other difference is like there will be a slight minutes redistribution, mostly from the bench though.
And then, James Johnson, 7 minutes, significant or otherwise, we know that those are going somewhere else. Kessler Edwards got a DNP in that game. So that's, you can almost do the 1-to-1 there potentially as far as how that's going.
That's a good call. Actually, that's a better call. Sorry, that you're correct. It's Kessler's minutes that will increase. So nice job by you. I totally glossed
but it's also correct because what's funny about it is when you mention LaMarcus Aldridge, it is important to think about the fact that he had 23 minutes there. You can talk about even Kyrie Irving only playing 37 in this one. Seth Curry only played 29 minutes. Like those 3 players alone, including Kevin Durant and Bruce Brown, by the way, played 30 minutes. So there's actually an uptick on all those guys where everybody else's minutes come down. But when you think about 23 minutes from Aldridge, what I really look at is saying, okay, if those are going to go more to Nicholas Claxton, and you mentioned the potential with Andre Drummond and what could be positive or negative matchups. I want to touch on that in a second, but Claxton then changes the flow of the offense. He, I think, plays in better rhythm with this offensive style with Kyrie Irving and with Kevin Durant than necessarily LaMarcus Aldridge does. We know the pace picks up there, which I think benefits Brooklyn. I mean, listen, 126, 120. It's not like you look at the box score and go, if only we could have scored more. But I do think there are benefits on both ends having more Claxton than LaMarcus Aldridge, even when you look in there and see 14 from LMA.
Yeah, and just like a final thought along those lines about the box score. It's funny because Tatum actually did run 41 minutes in this game, and it's hard to think you're going to get too much of an increase off that number. So where, KD plays 39, Kyrie plays 37, Tatum's 41 is getting close to the level of where that expectation is. And so we kind of say these things is to say, I think we spent this first part saying like, they lost that game, but there's a lot of ways that this game was very close. I even remember talking about at the time in the post game of this one, it was like, this game really could have gone either way here. Like This was a very close match. I know they lost by 6. This was a very closely matched game. And I think that's probably just going to be the theme of the series. We'll talk about it with Corrales. And in a second, we're going to talk about this sort of how the way the schedule breaks down here, how the schedule of the series breaks down and what it actually means for both teams, because both teams go into the series with question marks. And I think the way that the series just goes like through the calendar, this is going to matter for both teams. We're going to talk about that in a second. First, I'm going to talk to you about our friends over at betonline.net. Look over at betonline.net right now. They get the series number for Celtics Nets right now. Celtics minus 150 for the series, 60% chance by BetOnline for the Celtics to go ahead and beat the Nets over 7 games. You don't like it? You go over to BetOnline, put a little cheddar on the Nets side of that thing. So that's because BetOnline has you covered for all of your betting needs. They're their number one source for all betting stats and sports info. They have all the sports development, they have league reviews, news, all through the basketball playoffs, Major League Baseball as well. Of course, BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, from live betting for the playoffs, esports, and more. Head on over to betonline.net. Use your mobile device and learn about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts.
So as we say, there's not a big sample size to take away from what carries over. It'll be interesting in some regards to think about, does it benefit Boston that they had basically the same team all the way through? Is it a positive for Brooklyn that they will be coming out with a bit of a new look for Boston to deal with? That'll play itself out over the course of the series. But one thing we can look at right now is how the schedule of this series plays itself out, specifically from the Brooklyn Nets side of things. We know they ended up having to play Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, big minutes down the stretch of the season just to make sure they secured that 7th seed to have the home game against Cleveland in the play-in. Okay, check that box. They also had to play big minutes to get through that game and secure the 7th seed. But because they won that game, they grabbed themselves 4 days of rest, Doug. And when you look at it, first game of this series is going to kick off on Sunday the 17th, 3:30 tip-off in that game. Game number 2, remember, it's going to start on the road, back-to-back games, will not be until the 20th. So 2 full days off in between, and it's obviously going to be a nighttime game. And then game number 3, we'll pause there, is on the 23rd. Another multiple day rest in between there. In some regards, for everything it took for Brooklyn to make sure they got themselves to the playoffs, having this much rest ahead of and then in between those first 3 games, it feels like in a lot of ways, at least for me, I'll take off the excuse of the rest fatigue factor because it feels like that extra rest is built into this now.
Yeah, and I think between the two teams, this is up for debate, and I don't have good analytics on this exact part. It does feel to me like the rest factor is much more important for the Nets than it is for the Celtics. They're way more dependent on 2 guys that are absolutely crucial for every single thing that they do in a way that the Celtics aren't quite as reliant on just at the top. They're a little more dispersed at the top. They clearly have a superstar in Tatum, but right after that, there is a nice dispersion of talent on their team in the way that the Nets don't quite have. So getting those 2 guys more rest, I think is pretty crucial just because of the amount of just crazy load that is on both Kevin Durant and Kyrie. So look, that's just my opinion. I could probably be argued off that one. The other piece of this, though, is the time frame that now allows these 2 teams to possibly get for the first time have key players in this one, because the Celtics are without Robert Williams. He has had a meniscus issue, and there's speculation that he could be available for this series, but they're not sure when. And then obviously on the net side is Ben Simmons, where I'm pretty much done with the speculation about figuring this out. I saw multiple things, interpreting an Instagram post that he had of a smiley face or some emoji, and that's always what he posts right before he plays. I mean, this is where we are with the Ben Simmons injury news, is evaluating Instagram live stuff from
he had a
year
Caesar
ago.
salad for lunch. It must mean he's coming back.
I will say the evidence was there that he was going to play. If you use only Instagram stuff, like that was, I'm not sure it holds up in a court of law, but like it did. It was I was like fairly convinced that would have been. Anyway, point being,
Jayson Tatum taken to court over the fact that he in fact posted a smiley face, and we all know the evidence clearly shows, Your Honor, he was supposed to play.
So anyway, like this is, but yeah, I mean, where do you think? Because it seems to me like, okay, I guess here's the question. One, do you agree with that the rest helps the Nets more than the Boston? But then the second part is, is it better to have not enough time for either guy to get back? Like, is it more important for them? You know what I'm saying? Am I phrasing that correctly? Is it more important? Like, if time is an issue, would we rather just not have Robert Williams back at all, and we'll be without Ben Simmons too because it's not enough time? Because I think that's really kind of more what the time thing is. Because otherwise, you can't predict when these guys are going to come back.
No, that's the equation, though, right? When you look at it, you'd say, well, Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, they're the older tandem as opposed to Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown. So older legs, more rest, always a good thing. Now, you could argue that they've both had some rest between the injury to Kevin Durant and the time away for Kyrie Irving. The Nets have other key players like Seth Curry in the ankle, like Dragic just getting out of protocols and getting himself ramped up, right? So I think that there's more for the Nets to benefit from in the rest over the first 3 games. However, when you do the second part of the equation of who benefits more from getting Ben Simmons or Williams, the hard part for me is it's like, well, we still don't know what Ben Simmons is going to be capable and ready to do when he gets out there. I mean, we know what he can do as a player, but we don't. Is it 10 minutes? Is it 15? Is it 20? Right? Can he at the minimum just pick up a defensive assignment? Because, yeah, that can swing the table in a huge way in this series if you give Kevin Durant reps off from picking up Jayson Tatum on the defensive end. Whereas Williams, this will feel like, though it's a month away for him with the injury, he'll be able to step back out. And I think even just his presence alone, when you add him into the mix with Horford, with Tice, you go, it's another big body. And we know how that impacts Brooklyn potentially because they're only 2 deep in that particular role there with Drummond and Claxton.
Like, right, exactly. That is actually the difference, is that you with Williams, at least you're saying to yourself, if you're a Boston fan, you're like, I at least know what we have with him if he's healthy and full. And, you know, coming back from the particular injury, there could be also some ramp up stuff. It's like not clear he comes back in and just plays, 30 plus minutes in a game.
Maybe they both come back and they just match up in the corner and nobody bothers them. They just kind of stand together. Like, it's symbolic. Hey, they're here. 4 on 4, spread the floor, guys.
We both agree that we're back, but we both agree that we really can't do anything either, right? Like, so some situation like that. Because right, at least the Boston side of this is that it is a known quantity, right? It is a known quantity about when those 5 guys play together, like, you just kind of know at this point what it all means, where no matter where they're going to be here. And by the way, it's like, just real quick, those 5 guys together, like, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but like, you functionally cannot score on these guys. Like, in the 443 minutes that those 5 guys, Horford, Tatum, Smart, Brown, Robert Williams, Time Lord, played together, their offensive rating was 121.3. The defensive rating was 96.97. Like, that's impossible. So if you just look at that number, you'd say, oh, if we had to vote to not get either back, I think you probably have to vote to not get Robert Williams back, because you just know that when he plays, the defense is completely and utterly elite in a way that you really actually don't kind of see that much in the NBA.
And the funny part being, like you said, which is more important or better? Well, the good news is, like, we know we're getting the rest in between these games. That's the schedule. The thing that we're not sure about these returning players, if to your point, if I signed up for it right now, I'd say, hey, if I can see Ben Simmons in the second round series, if he's going to return, great. I'll take my chances without Ben Simmons going into this matchup with Boston and not see Williams step onto the court for the Celtics.
And by the way,
that's a trade-off you would make if
anybody
was listening.
I was going to say, I fully recognize that these are 2 completely mutually exclusive events. Like, Ben Simmons' health has 0.0 to do with Robert Williams.
It's 1-to-1.
So before anyone jumps into the comments, and that is not lost on me. Like, I understand that these 2 things are going. It's more just evaluating what the overall timeline is.
Yes.
Because when we're evaluating the timeline, I'm only just saying this is something we clearly know. There is enough of a sample to know what Robert Williams means to the Celtics. There is no doubt that Ben Simmons improves the Nets. It's just unclear the amount. That's all I'm saying.
One last footnote on that is, it looks like if I mean, good Lord, it's just such a good time to be a Brooklyn Nets fan or covering them. If Ben Simmons were to return, they're speculating it could be for game 1 against Boston. Whereas for Williams, they're talking about the back end of the series, game 6 potentially. So that surge that Boston could get could be something they're looking for as this series moves along, where the Nets could be having Ben Simmons out there a little bit sooner and hopefully maybe ramping and working himself gradually into form. That being the case, though, as Doug mentioned a little bit earlier there, coming up in a minute, we're going to talk about some intangible stats that we think about when you talk about the best players in the game. Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, Jayson Tatum, clutch gene. Does that outweigh the value of elite defense? Doug has some stats that we kind of have to go toe-to-toe with here. And I'm going to tell you why clutch will outweigh all of those other possibilities right after, though. I talked to you about our friends over at Shady Rays. Oh, Shady Rays. They're an independent sunglass company that gives you the features of $200 sunglasses for a fraction of the price. That means polarized lenses, well-constructed durable frames, and premium high-end finishes. Also, something you won't find anywhere else is that Shady Rays has an insane protection program. They will include a replacement for lost or broken protection plan on every single pair that they purchase or sell, as I should say, to you and me. They will also send you a brand new pair if you lose them, no matter what happens. Doesn't matter if you just put them on the top of your car and drove off like a madman. Didn't happen to me personally. I know someone that it did, though. Not only that, they're also going to donate 10 meals to fight hunger in America for every single pair of glasses that is purchased. It's a win-win, as we like to say here on the podcast. You head over to shadyrays.com and use promo code Locked On to get 50% off 2 or more pairs of polarized sunglasses. That's code Locked On over on shadyrays.com for their best deal of the season. 50% off on 2 more pairs of Shady Rays sunglasses, backed by over 150,000 verified 5-star reviews. So let's review, Doug. If we're talking about clutch versus defense, I said it there a moment ago. I'm going to go with clutch being more important because I know that Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving are capable of being more clutch, whereas Boston, as you said, even without Williams, they still have proven over the course of this season under former Brooklyn Nets coach Ime Udoka that they can clamp down and that can overcome some of their deficiencies on the other end.
Okay, so let me just real quick define clutch, because I'm not talking about clutch in terms of like, who gets the ball with the last 3 seconds to take a final 3-pointer. That's not the kind of clutch I'm referring to here. I'm talking about how the NBA would define clutch in terms of when games get close and tight, how teams perform when, sort of the money's on the line. It's within 5 points, within 5 minutes left to go of the game. And that's how the NBA, at least from a stats level, defines clutch. So I just need to be very clear, because some people hear clutch and they're like, yeah, my boy's clutch. Like, he just makes everything. I'm not here to say like who I would want to take a final shot. I would want Kevin Durant, but we're not going to sit here and debate which guy on each team I would want to take a final shot. That's not the clutch we're talking about. So, but what we can do is sort of dissect around how these teams act when the games are close and when they are close and tight, and how, like, what kind of works for them and what doesn't. And some of this is kind of high level, but it speaks to how it makes sense when you understand how both these teams operate. So from an offensive rating over the course of the season, the offensive rating for the Brooklyn Nets in these clutch situations is 118.8. That ranks 10th in the league. So, top third in the league in, how they do when the games are close. Very good on defense, by the way, too. 98.6. That, is good for the that is good for the 11th best net rating in the league. Okay, you're like fine. Like, that kind of makes sense to me, right? The offense should be pretty good. They have 2 incredible offensive players on this team. By the way, when you look down this list, it's pretty clear around like the rest of the teams that perform well in the clutch, because they have like transcendent-ish offensive talents on them. Right. It all makes sense, but sometimes numbers are easy. What's interesting though is when you go down and look at actually what Boston does in close games. Boston, on an offensive level, like, really struggles in clutch stuff. They rank second to last in the league in offensive rating in clutch situations. Now, they have not been in as many. They got in a lot of blowouts this season, later on specifically too, but they have an 87.8 rating. And when you think what you know about Boston, that kind of part does make sense also, right? Because you look at them, and you say, okay, well, they don't have great primary attack ball handlers, right? Their point guard is effectively Marcus Smart, but it's really kind of a combination of what Tatum and Jaylen Brown do, and they initiate some high post offense through Al Horford. So like, okay, they don't have a creator, right?
Mhm.
Tatum's gotten better. We saw it the other day, but they don't have this like true end of clock, end of game creator in the same way that the Nets do. Now they shut it down on defense really well, and that's why they're still a very good team. It's like they make up for it on the back end by being amazing on defense. But if we want to look at like what playoff games are essentially, sometimes I would call them like one big clutch situation,
Right.
right? Like, because you're gonna get what theoretically should be the best version of what two teams are doing when they're absolutely going at it for an exact 48 minutes, which is not always the case in the NBA. But in these clutch situations are representative of it because that is when teams are probably trying to do their absolute best. That makes sense. So like
Yeah,
when you
well, it's
hear
like
those numbers, God,
no, it's like Kyrie Irving, you say, oh, all of a sudden he ramps it up and locked down James Harden in that big matchup against the 76ers. And you're like, oh, I thought Kyrie Irving wasn't a really good defender. No, as we've always said, defense is about effort, not about ability. And when it comes to the playoffs, guess what? I'm going to start locking in more to those specific opportunities, which
or when
shifts that dynamic.
or when it's late in games, like who do you want? And when it gets very hard to score because
Yes.
everyone is locked into their own individual assignments like this, and the pressure is really high, and the intensity on the defensive end is really high. Who do you want to have the ball? The aforementioned Kevin Durant, who I wasn't going to get into, like, I'm now doing the thing that I said I wasn't going to do, but which is compare who I want to take last shots. But it makes sense in your mind when you think about basketball. It's like, right, when it gets really hard, and this is when it will be its absolute hardest to score. Who do you want to try to score in these situations? You're like, well, Kevin Durant and Kyrie, like this is who you want. So this is where the numbers sometimes shake out in a way that make a lot of sense in terms of what you already sort of just see with your eyes, right? It's like, yeah, this makes sense to me that this one team would be really good at it and this other team would struggle. And the Celtics are trying to make up for it by just making sure you also can't score.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see too, because for as high and efficient as they are on the defensive end, again, if I'm going to look at it and say what could be diminished, right? The value of a Marcus Smart, who we know, I said this, I say this all the time. I hate Marcus Smart on every other team that I've ever seen him on, Boston. But if he was on my team, he'd be my little pet monster, right? It's like Pat Beverly for the Timberwolves now this year. You're like, good Lord, I hate this dude. Unless you want to sign a vet minimum, come on over. But even when you say Marcus Smart can be that kind of defender, he can have that type of presence. Again, it's not true of every single team, but it is true of the Brooklyn Nets when you have Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant. There's not a scenario here where I think, oh no, that player is going to be the X factor of preventing the Nets from getting their offensive look when it matters the most. I'll double down around that too, because I would say, we talked about from last season coming into this year, it's a very different Boston team in terms of how they execute and play. But Brooklyn is different too. Coming out of that break, adding the pieces that they did, this is going to look different than any game essentially over the course of the season. That last one was a good sample size, but when you have Seth Curry and you have Bruce Brown and you have Dragic around Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, all of a sudden things look a little bit different. And I've now been banging this drum for a few episodes, and I'll continue to do it because I think it's as important as anything. And I mentioned this stat over on Twitter this morning. Kevin Durant averaged 7.3 and 8.4 assists per game over the last 2 months of the season, respectively. That was the post-Harden era. And if you think that won't be a factor, I'm not saying he's going for 11 assists per game in a series because his scoring is the most important thing he can do. But if you don't think that won't be a factor in this series and series going forward, should they advance, you're kidding yourself, because I think this is the next phase of his game, and it's predicated on having the options that defenses have to respect. It's much different when you don't have Curry in the corner, when you don't have a veteran like Dragic, and when you don't have Drummond and Claxton with what they're able to do attacking towards the rim. So these things, for me, if we're talking about pseudo thinking about predicting the series, those are the areas where I think it diminishes a little bit of what Boston's going to want to accomplish on the defensive end and starts to swing it in the favor of the Nets and their offense.
Yeah, for sure. The best way to break down a good defense is to have balance and multiple weapons that you can't basically leave alone, right? Like this is what usually ends up bogging.
By the way, can't do what you did in that Cavs game. Sorry, can't do what you did in the Cavs game where 34 minutes from Seth Curry and no points, right? Like that can't be what you do when those opportunities come. But in theory, if you reward the defense or your teammates for being punished with double teams by knocking down shots, it shifts and puts the defense then on their heels.
Correct. And that's what they're going to need to do to win, right? Like going to, and we'll talk about this with Corrales because like he's going to have some insight, even more insight into sort of how he thinks that the Celtics are going to attack the Nets. And I think some of the ways are going to be pretty obvious. And I'm sure that he's going to have some other things that like we didn't think about, but these are the things that we do need to consider going into it, and about having the more balanced they can become to not rely on these other guys. It makes it so that it's easier for everybody. It's not just easier for the other guys to get good shots. It then makes it so that guys like Durant and Kyrie can get good shots again against, I don't want to undersell this, like the Boston's defense, even without Williams, but is awesome. Like Williams at one point was he was like a little bit lower down, but it was like 5 or 6 in defensive player of the year category. Marcus Smart might just win defensive player of the year this year. And so like they just have absolute elite dudes. Can I ask you, I want to pivot really because we're getting out of here. I have a question because you mentioned Pat Beverly. This has nothing to do with the Nets, but I want to throw it in here. Do you watch, we both watched the end of this Clippers Timberwolves game. What are your thoughts on how the Clippers celebrated the end of that game?
How the Wolves,
like Beverly, what's that?
How the Wolves celebrated?
Oh, sorry. How the Timberwolves, how they celebrated. Because I saw this both go. I never talked to you about this. But they really went for it in their celebration. Like I'm trying to not couch what I think about this. Like Edwards is up on the table. Pat Beverly legit was crying. Like, and this is what made me think of it. Pat Beverly was crying after the game to win the play and to get to the playoffs. What did you think about that? Watching that celebration
on an individual level with Pat Beverly. This is the thing from afar where you go, boy, I do not appreciate this guy, because there's some level of showmanship, of elevating himself above the game. It was about him, and he said it in the post-game press conference, and he talks a little bit of smack at his former team, and that's all good. Like, I'm here for it, and I think he was putting himself a little bit before the team. Everybody else, however, who are young, who haven't been to the playoffs, right? Mm-hmm. You have young players. They haven't been there since 2019 or 2018, first time back. So a lot of guys are going there for the first time. It's a game where Cat fouls out. So theoretically, he could have been the absolute dumpster of this game were they to have lost it. I get a young team in the Western Conference has had a really exciting season for them. D'Angelo Russell, former Net. I get them being jacked up for it. And it kind of doesn't matter. Like if they turn around and they lose in the first round of the playoffs, no one's going to go, oh, shouldn't have been overexcited about that win. Like you're projected to lose. It's going to be a good series against the Grizzlies, but a younger man would have talked very ill of the way they celebrated. A slightly older version of myself looks at it and goes, you know what? Enjoy that moment, because you don't know what's going to happen in the first round of the playoffs. And why not savor the fact that you got a big win? And even if you lose in the first round, it's not going to diminish what you accomplished beating a Clippers team, beating Paul George. Like that matters. I think it at least sends a statement in general that, hey, we're building something here. And I'm fine for them to get behind that, minus Pat Beverly.
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually hadn't separated it too, but I think I had the same reaction, because I think now that I realize it, because in the moment I defended it, we'll get out of here after this, but at the moment I defended it, because I'm like, hey, look, you're allowed to be excited at sports. Like, what are we doing here? Like, we don't need to clutch our pearls because because
you've been here before.
Because 20,000 fans are going absolutely badass crazy that you just won this game. What are you going to do? Just walk off the court? Like that'd be equally insane behavior. And the histrionics around Pat Beverly, maybe it's just because I find him like slightly impossible. I'm sure if he was on the Nets, he'd be my favorite player. Yep. But watching it, I find it, and he looked like he was completely shot out of a cannon. He played amazing. But I don't know. I was like, the tears. I don't know. Like you're a veteran. I did find that to be a little weird, but I was struggling with why there should be a difference, because people are people. Everyone should be allowed to be happy. You shouldn't like get older and be less happy. So I was just, I don't know. You know what I mean? So I
did have the moment of being like, Beverly, you shouldn't be, you've been here before. You're supposed to be the veteran leading this team. You're reacting as wildly as anyone. So again, I swung the pendulum a little bit, but ultimately, man, I'm here for it. And it should make for a good first round series in the Western Conference. I will just quickly say here before we get out, I don't know if you've noticed these last couple of episodes. I'm now standing, by the way, when we do these podcasts, but I am so jacked up around the playoffs starting. You're going to have to. This is one of those things. We make packs on the show. Try to keep me in check, because I'm probably going to be going a mile a minute every single post game coming out of this series, because I've been waiting for this. This is a healthy Nets team, healthy Kevin Durant, healthy Kyrie Irving. Like, it's what you've been waiting for over 2 years now. It feels like the culmination is here. So I'm here for it, buddy. I'm ready to roll.
Oh, I'm right with you. That's why I kind of wanted to I have to do another whole podcast about just what I saw from these last two games. Then we started late in here because we were watching the Hornets and Hawks, but then Hawks did us, Hornets kind of did us a favor by getting to start the podcast early because I was like, let's just wait till that game's over, then we can talk about it. I was like, well, they're down 30. Let's just get on this thing. Okay, we're gonna get out of here. Make sure you go over to YouTube, subscribe over there. Also, make sure you rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts, free on every platform. Those are the two ways, totally free, that you can help the podcast. And we're so appreciative as we see the numbers just continually climb. Just a great feeling as we head into the playoffs. So like and subscribe over on YouTube, like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
It's the playoff, babies. Remember this: the body cannot live without the mind. Morpheus.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. R.I.P. You never know with that guy. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Redux.